In this lesson, we are going to jump from talking about individual types of organisms, so things like the bacteria, the archaea, different types of quote-unquote protists, the plants, the fungi. So all of these different groups of organisms have been the focus of our talks for the past couple weeks, but now we're going to start to put the pieces back together, looking at how these organisms interact with one another and form what is called a community. And so we could look at this picture of Sedona, Arizona, and we could see individual plants, right? We can see grasses down here. We can see prickly pear cactus. We can see yucca. There are junipers, there are pinyon pines, right? So lots of different plants are really the most obvious features of this ecosystem. But now I hope that we can start appreciating the fact that there are also microorganisms and of course smaller organisms that we wouldn't necessarily have seen before, and really to start putting all of these pieces together. So for example, in arid environments such as the Southwest, there's something called a crust, and so you might see stickers if you go to Grand Canyon saying don't bust the crust. Well, pretty much that means you're supposed to stay on the trail, right, and not go off the trail, because these environments are so arid and they're so inhospitable to living that microorganisms take a really long time to grow and to colonize. And as soon as you step off the trail, you start to hinder their development. And so the crust actually is a type of soil ecosystem that begins with cyanobacteria, right? So bacteria that is usually colonized or usually isolated to wet environments, and so specific types are able to colonize really arid environments, and they facilitate the growth of other organisms like lichen. Remember, lichen is a photosynthesizer and a fungus together, and then soon they're mosses, etc., etc. So these very fragile, very tiny communities are part of the basis of the entire community structure in the desert. So it's really important to stay on the trail. And throughout the rest of this slideshow, we're going to be looking at different types of communities and some different ways that we study the communities. First of all, again, we have been talking about different types of organisms, from microbes all the way up to, for example, giant sequoia trees. So a lot of diversity, and these organisms interact with each other in innumerable interactions, right? So all these different species are interacting with each other. They're interacting within the species. And so just as a reminder, we've been talking about populations of particular species, right? We know that there are individual organisms, right? And natural selection often acts on individuals. Certain individuals have beneficial traits, other ones have less beneficial traits, and so natural selection acts on the organisms, which will lead to evolution at the population level. Right? And these different populations come together to interact with one another in communities. We can, of course, keep on going up with these different levels of organization. Right? We know that the ecosystem is not only the biotic interaction, so just species A interacting with species B, but also the abiotic factors, so things like weather, things like nutrients, etc. We talked about biomes earlier in the semester, right? So biomes are characteristic ecosystems that are found in pretty predictable areas of the world. And we'll look at a couple different types of biomes today, including that in South Jersey. And a term we haven't talked about before, and that is the biosphere, and that is all of the life on the surface of the planet. And so the level that we're really focusing on right now is the community. You can hear my community in the background, perhaps. The bird is excited about the birds outside. But communities are essentially looking at the sum of all the interactions among all of the species within that particular area. All right, so we'll see just how complex that gets and how quickly. We can assess community by merely looking at how many species there are. Right? There's zebras versus lions versus acacia trees. And we can, of course, compare the relative abundance of those species. All right, so tons of zebras, but maybe not as many of other species. And we can analyze communities in terms of some of the physical attributes. And so this is not necessarily jumping up to the ecosystem level. This is merely considering the physical structure that something like, for example, a plant would provide. So, as number one said on the previous slide, the study of communities really is focused on looking at the interactions between species. Usually, or historically, this has involved looking at a pair of species. This species A eats species B, and so looking at the predator-prey dynamics between that pair of species. But over time, we can start putting together these pairs into a network, which is of course much more reflective of the actual community in existence. So this gets really complicated really quickly. In elementary school, you might have constructed some food chains. While food chains are not entirely realistic, in reality, communities produce more of a food web, right? This organism eats that organism, but it is in turn eaten by this one, or that one over there. And so we can put together all of these different known associations into something like a food web. And so what we can see here is a food web in Africa. We can see that it's not a chain, right? Each organism eats or is eaten by a variety of other species. Okay, and this isn't even including all the microbes and all the protists. This is just plants and animals here, so it gets wildly complicated. Just a reminder of some terms that I'm sure you've heard in other classes, so I won't spend too much time on them, but each subsequent level in a food chain or a food web is called a trophic level. We can see trophic levels over here. All right, so down here we have the lower trophic levels. In fact, the lowest is the primary producers. These are the primary organisms that are taking energy from the sun and converting it into a usable form, usable that is by other organisms. So these are the primary producers, and they are of course eaten by consumers. All right, so the first organisms that are going to eat the primary producers are primary consumers. Right? The predators that eat those consumers are called secondary consumers, and so on and so forth up the food chain or the food web. Okay, so these are terms that I'd imagine you're already somewhat familiar with. You should know what they mean, and your textbook does do a pretty good job of explaining them as well. Okay, but what I want to focus on now is the fact that not all of these species are created equally. Right? Not that one is better than the other, but what I'm getting at here is that some species have a disproportionate influence on the diversity of the rest of the species in their community. So disproportionate as in the number of individuals exerts a much stronger control than you would expect when assessing the entire community. Okay? And so generally biologists look at species that exert this disproportionate effect from the top down or from the bottom up. And so what that's indicating here is that a predator here, the cheetah, is pretty much at the quote-unquote top of the food chain or top of the food web. And he can exert all sorts of influence on everybody else from here on down. So from here to here to here. So ultimately, the cheetah can have an influence on this grass from the top of the food web. Right, on the other hand, species can have an influence from the bottom up. So here is an acacia tree. We can see that it is the food source for the impala. All right, and the impala is eaten by all of these different predators. And so the acacia tree can affect the populations of all of these different predators up here, even though it is all the way at the bottom of the food web. And we're going to look at some examples here and add some extra terms on the next few slides. So bottom-up control. Right, so this is where essentially the primary producers are influencing the entire food chain from the bottom of said food chain. Okay. Some examples might be redwoods and redwood forests. Right, so they are the dominant plant species in these forests in California, and so they are going to be influencing all of the other species in that particular environment, not just because they act as a food source, but also, of course, because they act as shelter. And the same thing with kelp. So kelp and kelp forests is a great example of a plant exerting bottom-up control. And so these are the kelp forests off the coast of Argentina, and kelp are at the base of the food chain. They are eaten by all sorts of different things. All right, so note in food webs that the arrows are following the flow of energy. All right, so here we have fish and invertebrates. All right, they are going to be eating the kelp. Okay, so we see the arrow going up in this direction because that is the flow of energy. Okay, so kelp serves as a food source for these tiny fish and invertebrates. Also, crabs eat kelp, and kind of indirectly, abalones eat kelp, right? So everything eats kelp. Kelp is what is there to eat, and so this is the first place where energy that has initially been taken from the sun, converted into a usable form, is passed up the food chain. And so kelp can therefore influence the sea otter population and larger fish and octopi populations because if there's more or less kelp, that will influence how many smaller fish there are, right? Which is then going to influence how many crabs there are, which then influences how many otters there are. And so the kelp forests or the kelp plants exert bottom-up control because ultimately any change in their population is going to have an effect on all of the other levels of the food web. And so these plants that really do serve as the foundation of the entire food web for the entire community are often called foundation species or sometimes even ecosystem engineers. Not because they're exerting bottom-up control, but because they are not only providing the primary food source, but also they are providing a physical structure that is habitat. They are literally changing the environment to provide more habitat and more diverse habitat for a variety of organisms. So a good example of this, in addition to kelp, in addition to redwoods, is the Cottonwood Tree in southwestern North America. And so what you can see here, let's see down here in Colorado, in the valleys we have just kind of grass, so more or less savanna typed environment, but then along the river we see that there are these huge deciduous trees called cottonwoods. Okay, also in Arizona. Right, here we can see the prickly pear cactus, a very dry, very arid environment. The rest of the land is covered with these really sticky, shrubby typed plants. There is no shade really. They're all very thorny and spiky, and so not particularly palatable to a lot of organisms. They don't provide a lot of shelter to things like birds. And so that makes the cottonwoods really stand out. So you can see here in the fall, these are deciduous, so they are changing colors. Their leaves are changing colors. We can really see them, and they, just like in the picture in the bottom right, are surrounding a river. Okay, and so these plants provide not only a palatable source of food, but also they are much taller than the surrounding plants, so they provide a ton of vertical structure for birds, for spiders, for all types of organisms to live in these trees. And so they are literally changing the environment. Without these species, there would not be nearly as much habitat, not nearly as much diversity as there is with these particular species. Another example of this is the corals. All right, so coral is a symbiotic relationship as well between a photosynthesizer and an animal-like plant, or sorry, an animal-like organism. And so these, again, are the primary producers. They are using energy from the sun to convert into a source that is usable by animals. And so they are not only providing a source of food, but of course they are providing a structure. They are providing a physical habitat. They are changing the environment for additional animals to live in. And so we can call foundation species like the cottonwood, like the kelp, like the corals, we can call these keystone species. And so the term keystone species is more generic. Right? It's not just talking about these bottom-up organisms. Instead, keystone species is just a term referring to a species that exerts a very strong control on the community. Right? You see a completely different community in the cottonwoods than you would 20 feet away in the desert. Okay, so a completely different community. Without the cottonwoods, without the corals, biodiversity would plummet in these particular areas. Okay, and so keystone species, again, do not have to be plants or photosynthesizers, but in this case, the plant/photosynthesizer is a keystone species. Specifically, we can classify them as the ecosystem engineer type of keystone species. And we'll come back and we'll try to parse out these terms a little bit more later. Okay, so another way that individual species can exert a larger control than you might expect given their biomass is from the top down. So this is predators exerting a strong influence. And so what we can see up here in the top right is that in a community with predators is going to be pretty balanced. You might think of predators being so mean, you know, they're eating all of these other fish, all these other animals, and so that's so mean. No, they're actually maintaining a very delicate balance maintaining a delicate balance between all these different organisms in the food web. Okay, and so with predators, the predators eat the herbivores, keeping the herbivore population down, and therefore not completely decimating all of these plants. Right? So the plants are then able to continue sequestering carbon. Right? So via photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is pulled out of the air and it is deposited into the soil as the plants store it within their tissues, the plants die, and then that stored carbon then becomes sediment within that environment. Also, having a lot of plants protects the coast. Right? So a lot of coastal protection. This is very robust to soil erosion. Right? During things like hurricanes, plants in soil are going to hold the soil in place a lot better than just bare soil. And so what happens if we remove the predator? Right? So this can be from overfishing, this can be from a loss of habitat, right? Larger mammals need a lot of space to live, and so if we remove the predators through whatever means, we collapse that ecosystem essentially. Right? So let's see, I'll point out over here in the bottom right that if we add fishing, right, and this is like a lot of fishing, so it's really crushing the fish population. So you see here a minus, the fish population is going to go way down because not only is it being predated upon by the osprey, but also humans are overfishing, so fishing in a non-sustainable way. Okay, and so without the appropriate number of fish, what's going to happen is the crab population is going to explode. And that's a problem because with more crabs, they're going to be eating more of the vegetation. Okay, so when predators go down, the population of herbivores goes up, which then in turn reduces the vegetation of that particular community. And so as you might imagine, with less vegetation, there's less food to support everything else, but also we also lose some really important what are called ecosystem services. So for example, we reduce the carbon sequestration, right? So less carbon is being pulled out of the air and deposited in the soil and stored there, and therefore global warming, right? And also with less vegetation, you get more coastal erosion, right? You get less of this resistance to erosion during a storm. And so this is really important for people in New Jersey, for example, because we really like to live on those barrier islands. So we really like to live in places that are very susceptible to soil erosion. Of course, you see that dunes are built up, and always the dunes are covered with vegetation, and this vegetation isn't there to be pretty, it is literally there to keep the dunes in place. And so again, without this vegetation, you get a lot of soil erosion, you get less carbon sequestration, and you get less vegetation by oftentimes removing the predators. Okay, so in this case, the predator is also a keystone species. All right, so by removing this top of the food chain, what we see is a strong effect much farther down the food chain. Okay. Next, I'm going to show you a clip that is showing you another example, specifically the wolf in Yellowstone, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about that. As the clip just showed, the wolves are a top-down or predator keystone species. The elimination of wolves in the early 1900s and subsequent reintroduction almost 90 years later was really a natural experiment, not on purpose, but of course it was, showing us how these predators, instead of damaging the ecosystem, they're actually helping to balance the ecosystem. And this graphic off to the right shows you just some of the different relationships that the wolves are involved with, and therefore the reintroduction of wolves ultimately reduced these populations, the herbivore populations, and by reducing the herbivore populations, ultimately the plant life was able to increase. And so the wolves are a keystone species, and their reintroduction was able to produce what is called a trophic cascade. So this is the wolf as a keystone species having effects on other trophic levels, maybe 2 or 3 steps away. Right, so the wolf, of course, had an impact on the cottonwoods by controlling the herbivore population. Okay, so to go back to the studying of communities, right, we've already talked a little bit about how food webs work, how we can study interactions between individual species and then start to put them together into this larger network. Biologists also study the total number of species and the relative abundance of those species. We can use a lot of different metrics. In general, we can call the number of species present species richness, and the diversity or the relative abundance species diversity. And there are a lot of different indices for actually expressing these diversity values. Your textbook introduces the Shannon Index, which again is one of many. And so what the Shannon Index and others do is they actually weight the abundance of animals or the species according to how abundant they are in the community. And so what we can see here is three different example communities. The first community has 6 different species, but for the most part, 5 of those species are very small, and the population of one species is very large. Community 2 also has 6 species, but they're all relatively the same size, and community 3 has a lower species richness, right? That is, it has fewer species. It only has 5 instead of 6. However, of those 5 species, all are pretty much the same size. Right? So if we actually calculate the Shannon Index, which I would never ask you to do, but if you did calculate the Shannon Index, what you would see is that community 1 and 2 have the same richness, that is, they both have the same 6 species, or the same number of species, but of those two, community 2 has a higher diversity because the population sizes are more even. Community 3, again, has a lower species richness because it has fewer species, but it has a higher diversity than community 1 does because of its relatively even distribution of these species, of these individuals within the populations. Another way of measuring species diversity is called the Simpsons Diversity Index. And again, there are tons of these. I'm just giving you these 2 as examples, but we could assess the species diversity of raptors, or these predatory birds, in Yellowstone County. What we see in the first, or in the top bar here, out of 100% of the species, you know, red-tailed hawk, Swainson's hawk, black-shouldered kite, and barn owl, about a quarter of the total individuals in the community are belonging to each species. However, if you look at the second example here, what we see is that, yes, the species richness is the same, right? So this second area has the same number of species, the same 4 species are present, but most of those individuals, so 80% of the individuals, happen to be red-tailed hawks, as opposed to the other 3 species, which are not very well represented. And so looking at species diversity, as opposed to simply species richness, can give us a better idea about how robust that community is to extinction events. So what types of factors affect species richness? First of all, we have habitat size. Generally, larger spaces can support larger numbers of species. Right? Not only is there more space for more individuals to live, but also there are more niches available. Right? So things like plants and even animals and fungi, these organisms actually create habitat in a particular area. And so the more space you have, the more niches you have, therefore more species can be supported in that particular area. Okay. We can talk about habitats as a space within the land, right? So maybe one park versus the entire state, or we can talk about these habitats as islands, right? We could be talking about literal islands, right? So here is an island, a relatively large island that is close to the mainland over here, and here is a much smaller island way over here. Right? In theory, the larger island would be able to support a much higher number of species than the smaller island would over here. This graph up to the right shows you the number of species on an island, and on the y-axis it's also showing you the rates of immigration and extinction. And so I want to point out that larger habitats can support a lot more immigration. That is, they can support a lot more organisms colonizing from other places, and therefore the introduction of more and more species. Right? So the large islands can support more immigration than small islands can. Also, because competition is so strong on small islands, right? Limited number of resources, limited amount of space. The extinction rates are higher, right? There are more losers because there are less opportunities to succeed, right? So if you look at the equilibrium between immigration and extinction, what you can see is that when both of these factors are taken into account, small islands can support a smaller number of species than large islands can. This can also, so habitat size isn't just referring to actual islands in the ocean, but it's also referring to areas of habitat on the land. So what we can see down here in this map is the Four Corners and Wyoming region. The green and the orange are showing you preserved land. So essentially what we have is this really relatively large island, right? It might be surrounded by houses, it might be surrounded by anything else, but this large green splotch here is showing us preserved land. And so this is essentially acting like a relatively large island, right? A large island is going to support a lot of different species, whereas if we look at this over here, right, this preserved land is separated from the larger island of preserved land, and in theory it would be able to support fewer different types of species than the larger tract of preserved land would be able to support. On that same note, the level of isolation of these different habitats or islands also determines the number of species they can support. Essentially, islands per se that are really close to the larger mainland or the large tract of land that's preserved, they are essentially getting immigrants all the time. Right? There's a lot of gene flow back and forth between these two, large and small areas of land, and so you are constantly getting new individuals and new species, and therefore you're able to support more diversity. However, if you look at a more isolated island, right? So this is a much larger distance, right? There might be roads and trains and houses and all sorts of things in between the mainland and this island, and so in theory this right here would be able to support fewer species because it's just not getting the same amount of immigration. All right, once again, if we look above at the graph, we can see again rates of immigration or extinction, and remote islands, that is this separated tract of land right here, can support fewer species than those that are near a larger tract of land. And so we can take this information into account. In general, land conservationists strive to preserve land that is continuous with one another, right? So this both allows organisms to migrate, right, in one single tract. You don't really have to cross roads, and for the most part they are protected for the entire way, but also it is providing a larger land area to support more biodiversity. Okay. Both habitat size and habitat isolation are both factors that Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson studied extensively to develop the theory of island biogeography. So again, this theory is explaining the relationships that are shown to you up in the right corner. Bigger habitats support more organisms and more different species of organisms, and less isolated habitats support more species as well. Okay, so there are more than just these two factors that affect the species richness of an area. We've talked about habitat size, we've talked about habitat isolation, but predator behavior is also another really important factor here. First of all, predators, as we've seen with the wolf, predators eat and even outcompete other types of dominant organisms. And so, for example, with the wolf, the wolves reduced the coyote population, and therefore small mammals were able to kind of bounce back in the community. Also, as we've seen a couple times at this point, more predators reduce primary consumers and therefore the foundation species. So the plants at the base, the bottom up of the food web are able to survive more abundantly. Climate stress, right? There are always trade-offs for different types of responses to climate, and so in theory, living in very northern latitudes that are very cold, it would be a lot more stressful than living, for example, at the equator, and so there are a lot of different trade-offs for those different characteristics. Next is habitat heterogeneity. So this means that the habitat is not 100% the same. You don't have what is called a monoculture, like your lawn. Everyone tries to get a monoculture. We just want this one species of grass, not dandelions, not vetch, not anything else, just one single type of species. But in fact, the more diverse the habitat is, as you might imagine, the more different types of niches there are, and therefore the more species diversity and richness there will be. And finally, disturbance, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this for the rest of the PowerPoint, but the amount and type of disturbance to the community is going to give rise to a lot more different types of species. And so all of these factors and many more are going to determine how many organisms are present and successful in a community. And so we've talked about this briefly at the beginning of the semester, but in the tropics, so around the equator, we see the highest levels of species richness. And so here is a map that is color-coded according to species richness, and as we can see here in South America, again in the tropics, around the equator, all the way across, we see the most species richness. And so what's going on here is that there's relatively low abiotic stress, right? So there's no winter, so 365-day a year growing season. There's tons of light, there's tons of moisture, so this really does promote a lot of life to grow. Also, there's a lot of dispersal of seeds and other organisms, or their offspring. Lots and lots of animals disperse seeds in many diverse ways. And finally, generally, ecosystems in the tropics have intermediate levels of disturbance. That is, not too much and not too little. And so what's going on here is that because there is so much rain, most plants in the tropics don't really develop what are called taproots, which really deeply plant them to the ground. Instead, they spread their roots out, and so when there's a lot of wind, and especially with moist soil, the trees are going to fall over, leaving behind a gap in the canopy. And so what we see up top here actually is a tree cut off, but it works the same when the tree just falls over. Elsewhere in the forest is super dark, but you end up with a hole in the canopy, therefore allowing a lot of light, allowing a lot more different types of usually pretty grassy and shrubby vegetation to grow in these gaps. And that's going to become important in all of the ecosystems, right? But this is very prominent and very frequent within the tropics. So, which species ultimately end up in the community? All right, we've talked about how species interact. We've talked about how many species there are and the relative abundance of species, but who actually ends up in these different types of communities? So your book talks about Clements and the Clements-Gleason dichotomy. Essentially, these are two different scientists with relatively opposing hypotheses about who ends up in a community. So Clements argued that communities develop in the same way depending on abiotic factors, right? So as long as conditions A, B, and C are met, we're going to see these species grow, and then these species, and then these species, until ultimately you end up with a stable final climax community. But Gleason argued that community composition is completely random. right? It depends on history. It depends on, you know, a bird just happened to fly over this tract of land and defecate with a particular seed at a particular time, and that seed just happened to grow on a substrate that wasn't shaded over, and, you know, like lots and lots of different random events have to fall into place, and so every community should be relatively different. And so your book describes in pretty good detail experiments that explored this dichotomy, and long story short, it's somewhere in the middle. Every community is going to be somewhat different. You're never going to see exactly the same species richness, no matter, you know, where you're looking, even within the same abiotic conditions. But we also know that there is a predictable pattern of when species are able to grow and thrive. The community changes over time. Following a disturbance, we see relatively the same species showing up at the same times. And so the Clements-Gleason dichotomy, well, it's somewhere in the middle. It's a little bit of both. And so this process of changing over time is called ecological succession, and we're going to talk about that more now. Two different types of succession. First of all, we have primary succession. This is when some kind of very severe disturbance is going to pretty much wipe out all of the soil in a particular area, or expose bare rock for the first time. So for example, lava flows, we can see over here on the bottom right that in January of 2020, Mexico's most active volcano erupts. This is not very far from Mexico City, and so what we see is, you know, lava and of course ash covering up anything that is living on that earth near it. And so this lava isn't soil, right? We don't have available nitrogen, we don't have available bacteria, or like none of these things. And so life finds a way, right? Life is going to need to colonize this lava for the first time. Also, anytime a part of the ocean bottom is exposed again, glaciers melting, right? So down here again, this is from February 2020. Over the course of about a week, this piece of Antarctica used to be completely covered by ice, and it has been for centuries, for millennia, but now again, in a week, now we have new soil exposed for the first time in millennia. And so this is not colonized by life. It is not true soil yet. It is still bare rock. And so there's a process, right? Predictable stages of organisms that are going to come in, colonize this new ground, and ultimately make it inhabitable by other organisms. Right, I threw in here paved parking lots because it kind of works the same way. There's no soil, of course, in paved parking lots, but as always, life finds a way. Right? If you see a restaurant close down, within just a couple years, you'll see the parking lot growing over unless that parking lot has been maintained. And so this requires soil formation, which is done by immigration of organisms from surrounding environments. And so now I'm going to show you a clip on primary succession after a volcano.
Ecosystems are shaped by biotic and abiotic factors. But before biotic factors like plants, animals, and fungi can become established, we need abiotic factors like sunlight, rainfall, and nutrients. And today, I'm here with ecologist Joe Mascaro, and he studies how ecosystems change over time. And Joe's going to help us understand how we can start with solid rock, and through biotic and abiotic factors, they can change this rock to support life. So let's track the stages of primary succession by visiting lava flows of different ages.
So, Suze, this is the earliest stage of succession, where the rock's been colonized by lichen and some small sword ferns. these guys will colonize lava right away, almost the day after it cools. And once they do, they'll begin the soil formation process. So they'll grow and they'll start to break apart the edges of these rocks, which are really friable and easy to break. And then the lichen will fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, and that will begin to build up soil on the surface of the rock.
Now let's move to the next stage of succession, one that's a bit older.
Well, Suze, this flow looks like the ecosystem has developed a bit more than the last flow. So you can see how there's so much more lichen than there was on the previous flow. It's almost like a carpet. And as the lichen grows, it's basically breaking up the surface of the rock and starting the soil formation process, which is really happening in earnest now compared to the previous flow.
The first plants that become established are early colonizers. Early colonizers have other characteristics. They're fast-growing, they need lots of light, and they're usually wind dispersed.
That's right. And there's basically two types of early colonizers we might see on a flow like this. There's some that have a symbiotic relationship with fungi, and so they're able to fix atmospheric nitrogen directly and use it immediately. And then there are plants that are just able to tolerate really low levels of nitrogen, like ohia.
Okay, off to the next stage. So here we have an even older flow.
So we're actually going to see quite a bit more soil here than we saw in earlier flows. And we've really got a lot of moss. So we're really starting to see the ohias come together, and we're getting much closer to a closed forest. We're not quite there yet, but you can see how much taller they are and thicker.
Off to the next flow. So this is what scientists would call mature forest. It's over 300 years old. It might be hard to imagine, but this whole area was once barren lava rock. Let's go check it out.
So, we're definitely in a later successional forest now, which means we're dealing mostly with tree species that are not wind dispersed. They typically have big fruits, maybe dispersed by animals. They're much slower growing, and of course, they tolerate shade. And as a result of all those features, they tend to need a lot more nutrients over time to grow.
To summarize the video clip, primary succession involves colonizing bare rock for the first time, so there is no soil, and so this is a relatively rare event. It's not something you see all the time. It really is only after a very severe disturbance or the opening up land for the first time in a very long time. So primary succession isn't something that we in New Jersey see on a regular basis. However, we do see a different type of succession happening all the time. Ultimately, communities, as well as the populations and individuals within them, are very dynamic. They are constantly changing in response to different conditions, both abiotic, so environmental, as well as biotic conditions. We are constantly responding to disturbances, both as individuals, of course, as we're experiencing now, as well as the entire community is responding to disturbances. And so the next type of succession we're going to talk about is the reaction of an ecological community to a short disruption of the community. And so this involves forest fires, floods, disease epidemics, things like clear cutting and mowing and grazing. All of these are disturbances to the existing communities. And so what will happen with the community is ultimately determined by what type of disturbance we're talking about, right? So was it a fire? Was it a clear cut? Are you just mowing the same community over and over again? The frequency of the disturbance, and of course the severity. Most communities, especially in the Pine Barrens, which we'll go over extensively here today, most communities experience a type of disturbance on a predictable basis. So this is called the community's disturbance regime. So what is secondary succession? Secondary succession is not happening right after primary succession. Instead, secondary succession is the type of succession which occurs after a disturbance event where there is existing soil. As the soil is already present, we don't have to have pioneer species come in and make soil. Instead, pioneer species merely come in, utilize whatever is left over, and more rapidly establish a community. Once the colonization has begun, succession can be guided by how species interact with each other, as well as if there is another disturbance. And we'll talk about that in terms of the pine barrens where Stockton is located. Okay, but what I mean by species interactions is going to become more important. For example, these intermediate species here, right, when we start to get some vertical structure with shrubs and trees, ultimately these organisms literally change the environment. Like we talked about before, they are environmental engineers. And so they can create shade, right? So they can reduce the temperature, they can maintain moisture, they can insulate the soil and, the first structures of the understory for new types of organisms. And so it actually paves the way and facilitates the growth of new species. Usually, different climatic conditions produce a successional pathway. All right, so these species are pioneers. They're going to come in and colonize right after the disturbance. Then that paves the way for another type of species, which paves the way for another type of species, all the way up to the climax species. And so generally pioneer species versus climax community species, they share particular traits, although they are, of course, unique and varied species. First of all, pioneer species are generally easy to disperse. That is, a lot of them are dispersed, or a lot of these species seeds are dispersed by the wind. Right, so they're very small and easily carried to this new environment, as opposed to climax species, which might, drop acorns or something, and so those are a little bit harder to disperse very far. Pioneer species are very fast growing, so usually they are herbaceous, but not always. Herbaceous means they are more like a grass, so very flexible, as opposed to woody like a tree. And so the woody plants generally take a little bit more time to establish the very strong cell walls and lignin, and so they are going to take a little bit more time to establish themselves. Also, pioneer species are often short-lived, and they are selected or are strategists. So they make lots and lots of seeds in hopes that some of them are going to survive. And so pioneer species are often, they're often called weeds. Weeds are very much adapted to colonizing soils that have been disturbed, environments that have been disturbed, and doing so very quickly. And so that's why they grow in your garden, they grow in your lawn, because you are disturbing that soil and they can take advantage of those traits. So one example I want to point out of secondary succession is in New England. When the colonists first arrived, they saw this open land, and so they deforested huge tracts of land in places like New Hampshire, and they thought that they were going to establish agriculture there. And so what we see on the left is a farmhouse surrounded by these fields that the colonists have cleared. So that is a disturbance event. We can see the forest surrounding the fields, and so that's presumably what the entire landscape looked like before. Of course, the colonists quickly learned that rocky, nutrient-poor soil was awful to try to grow crops in, and so then they tried cattle. That also didn't stick very well, and so ultimately the agriculture in New England and places in New England tapered off, and they let the forests grow back. And so in the next slide we're going to walk through the different successional stages, but I want to point out that the picture on the right is a mature forest, probably 100 years old, just because that's when agriculture really starts to die off. And so what exactly would succession look like in a place like New England? Well, because of the soil conditions, because of the short growing season, and just the seed bed that's already there, what plants are already in this environment, disturbed environments, right? So in this case, agriculture, when left alone, they are going to be very quickly populated by things like grasses and wildflowers. So things like goldenrod are going to pop up really quickly. You know, if you're trying to grow crops, you would call these weeds and you'd want to get rid of them, but these really are literally paving the way for future species. Okay, so again, most of them are herbaceous, fast-growing, and are strategists. Over time, these additional plants are going to start attracting animals to the area. Right? So birds are going to fly from this tree over here, and they're going to say, there's a bunch of seeds here, I'm going to eat these seeds. Right? And while they're eating over here, they are going to defecate, and whatever they ate last, so the seeds from this tree are then going to be deposited out here, and so you end up with more and more trees from the surrounding forest ending up in this abandoned field. And so over decades, what you end up with are shrubs, right, which of course then grow into trees. And so these species that first grow, they really like light, right? So they don't really do well in the shade. They like a lot of light. They are relatively quickly growing, so not very good, at growing in the understory, right? So trees like this might be pines and poplars. Also, hemlocks are great at growing pretty early on. And while these trees are growing taller, they are of course changing the microclimate on the ground, and so this promotes the growth of different types of species that might be a little bit more slow to become established, but they like the shade and they need kind of this nice cushy damp environment in the understory in order to get established. And so these trees would be things like beech and maple trees, right? So when you think of New England, you think of the leaf peepers, right? You think of these beautiful tracts of land with red, yellow, and orange leaves in the fall. Those trees are climax species, so they had to become established once there was already a forest there to grow underneath. All right, so finally we get over here. This is a climax community. We can see nice pretty maple trees here. They grow in the shade of these other species like pines. Also, this right here is a picture in New England. What we can see in the canopy are things like pine and hemlock. So the same kinds of things that you would see if you live in North Jersey. Pines and hemlocks are the conifers that are dominant up there. And we can see that underneath are growing American beech trees, white birch trees, sugar maple trees. So all of these things grow for the climax community, and they need the extra protection of the conifers in order to become well established. So this isn't a climax forest yet, but it's well on its way to becoming a climax forest. So what exactly does succession look like in South Jersey? Well, for the rest of this talk today, I'm going to walk you through the different species that you might see, and then I will actually show you what these look like in the environment, both on campus and off campus, and just around the community that you might have seen. Okay, so in South Jersey, we have so many different types of disturbances, and I will show you lots of them. We have clear cutting for, building new malls, building new housing developments. We have clearing for agriculture or the maintenance of agricultural fields. We do still cut for timber, and also fire is a huge part of the disturbance regime of South Jersey. And so I want to introduce you to a couple pioneer species, and then we're going to follow them through the successional stages. And so first are the grasses. I'm not going to teach you about specific grasses, but keep in mind that the communities in South Jersey are maintained by fire. They are all adapted to fire, and the first successional stage is a grassland, and grasslands that are maintained by fire are called savannas. And so savannas are a normal part of the South Jersey ecosystem. Next, there are two trees that are wildly important for the development of forests in South Jersey, and the first is the eastern red cedar. We have all seen these. They are everywhere, on campus, off campus. They are in the marshes, on the way coming down to campus or up to campus, depending on where you live. These kind of dark brownish green shrubby trees are eastern red cedars. They are not technically cedars. In fact, they are junipers. We know that they're junipers when we look at their quote-unquote berries. These are the female cones of the eastern red cedars, or junipers, and they are covered with this fleshy blue substance that actually has a lot of medicinal values. The natives used to use it to settle their stomachs, to do various things during pregnancy, and people today still use these. They harvest them off the red cedars, and they can store pretty well just in a jar on the shelf, and they use it for all different purposes. All right, so those are the female berries. For our purposes, they are super important in so many different ways. First of all, they are really the first woody species that pops up after a disturbance. And their seeds are spread around very quickly because the female cones, right, the little berries here, are very palatable to birds, and so birds will spread them around via their fertilizer to colonize new fields. Okay, also, they grow really quickly. So 1 to 2 feet every year they're able to grow, and so within just a couple years after a disturbance, you see a shrubland of these eastern red cedars. Also, you can buy them for your garden or as a windbreak. You see them in a lot of fields that used to be farms and then got turned into housing farms or housing developments. You see a lot of them present there as well. So the second type of tree that I want to introduce to you as a pioneer species is the tree of the New Jersey pine barrens, which of course is where Stockton is located. This is the pitch pine, or Pinus rigida. It has a pretty big range from Canada all the way down to about Georgia and across to Ohio, but it is most dominant here in our pine barrens. The word barren means really nutrient poor and really hard to grow things, and these trees really have capitalized on those conditions. And so both pitch pine and eastern red cedar colonize newly disturbed communities, and they create structure, right? So they literally create habitat, right? Birds can live, you know, within these places, and as they're attracted to these saplings or these small shrubs, they bring with them insects, they bring with them extra seeds, etc. So take a walk with me through a couple different environments and note how we can see different stages of succession in different places around Stockton.